Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ASPI's latest webinar. My name is Dr. John Coyne, and I'm the head of two programs here at ASPI, the Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement Program and the Northern Australia's National Security Program. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for giving up what is a bit longer than normal webinar today for your lunchtime, which is the changing nature of the Philippines and US defence relations. Before introducing our speakers, I do want to acknowledge the fact that this event is sponsored by the Northern Territory Government, who also have a very strong interest in regional affairs and have asked us to cover off on this very issue. Now, I am pleased on behalf of ASPI to welcome four exceptional guests for today's webinar, each a well and truly an expert in their own field. Starting off, and I won't embarrass my ASPI colleague and senior analyst, Dr. Huong too, by going through her extensive career history. But I also would like to welcome Dr. Malcolm Cook, and both Huong and I would like to welcome Dr. Malcolm Cook. Now, Malcolm is a senior visiting fellow at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore and a visiting fellow at the National Security College in Canberra. He's worked on the Philippines, Australia, Singapore, South Korea and Japan. And from 2003 to 2010, he was the Lowy Institute's inaugural East Asian Program Director. And in 2011, he became the inaugural Dean of the School of International Studies at Flinders University in South Australia. And then in 2014, he became, in his current role, as a Senior Fellow. We're also joined by John Powers. John is an Executive Director at Intel Dynamics, which is a global firm based here in Canberra, specialising in behavioural and information economics to advance organisational capabilities in decision-making, critical thinking, cybernetics and intelligence analysis. Impressively, John has 40 years of operational experience in the US, Australian and Five Eyes special mission and intelligence communities. He's a retired paratrooper and a Band 3 member of the Senior Executive Service. His expertise with government and private sector organisations includes expansive experience with budgets and national security and international responsibilities. Finally, but just as impressively, is Dr. Jingdong Yuan. Jingdong is an associate professor and chair at the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. Dr. Jingdong's research focuses on the Indo-Pacific security and Chinese foreign policy, Sino-Indo-Indian relations, and nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. He's held visiting appointments at the National University of Singapore, University of Macau, East-West Centre, National Chiang Chai University, Mercator Institute for Chinese Studies, Fudan University, Berlin Social Sciences Centre, and the United Nations Institute of Disarmament and Research. And he has a list of publications that goes on for pages. I really don't want to take too much more of people's time other than say welcome this group and to sort of set at least the beginning of the scene of what we're doing here today. On the 11th of February this year, the Philippines President Duterte announced a unilateral decision to terminate the US government's visiting forces agreement. Now, this agreement dates back to 1998 and has provided the legal framework for the US military and its equipment to be deployed to and maintained in the Philippines. And this has also included the US government's support to counter-terrorism operations in the southern Philippines, both before and after the siege of Marawi. Now, this decision has originally generated a lot of controversy and questions about the core principles of the US and Philippines relationship. Interestingly enough, and we'll hear it today, it didn't raise as many eyebrows in DC. On the 1st of June, however, and after we advertised this event, and with no warning, the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs wrote to the US Embassy stating that, and I quote, "In light of political and other developments in the region, the termination was suspended." Now, that was for a 6-month period. While nothing is certain after the next 6 months suspension of the Philippine withdrawal, it does, however, underline the challenges between the US relationship and between the US government and Duterte and the Philippines, as well as the unpredictable nature of the situation in the South China Sea and China. In terms of format today, ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to do, or colleagues, what I'd like to do is I'm going to invite each of our speakers and guest panelists to give us about 10 minutes of remarks. At the conclusion of that, and to get people into the mood, I've got a couple of prickly questions to ask our panelists to get us started, after which we'll be turning to the audience. If you have a look on, you've got the facility there as being part of the webinar to be able to put questions through and to upvote those questions, and I'll hopefully mediate through those. Just before we started, John Powers goes, you know, John, why an hour and a half? Why not an hour? Originally, when Huong and I looked at this subject, we thought we'd do a whole day workshop on the issue. And today, of course, you know, we've got an hour, and we just wouldn't do justice to the diverse group of people that we've got on the panel without giving them at least 10 minutes to be able to talk, and then time for questions for you and us. With that all said and done, what I'd really like to do now is invite Dr. Huong to start off our event today with her initial thoughts.
John, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. As John said, we've been thinking about organizing a discussion about the Philippines, the relations with the US and defense relations and alliance, as well as VFA for some time after the decision was announced. But then COVID struck. In all these months, there have been different developments in the region. A lot of us had been taking attention to different directions, but I think it could not be more timely since the change of mind and the suspension for another 6 months was just announced earlier this month. So it gives a really good context to come back to the issue and revisit some of our questions, assumptions, as well as thinking of the possible potential opportunities related to those challenges.
We can't hear you through your sound at the moment.
John, I think you need to mute. So thanks again for our panelists to join us online, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. It's a great attendance today. So as John quickly gave you the overview, I'll just do three things very, very quickly. Lay out the background and the whirlwind chronology of the developments, highlight the remaining questions and what that means for border security relations in the region, particularly Southeast Asia, but also broader in the Indo-Pacific, as how the US alliance system is being perceived at the moment, before turning to my colleague Malcolm, who will give you a more in-depth domestic perceptions, domestic perspective in the Philippines. So as John said, on the 11th of February, President Rodrigo Duterte said unilaterally the termination of the visiting forces agreement, which was apparently a decision after one of the senators didn't get the tourist visa to the US, as a former police chief, Ronald de la Rosa, who is supposedly close a friend and ally to Duterte and one of perceived architect of Duterte's war on drugs. Then this, of course, had been not quite controversial decision. A lot of observers saw it as a poor exchange for a military for the sake of tourist visa. But Duterte used a very much anti-American language in a way. He justified decision, saying about accusing Washington about neo-colonial interference, and if a Filipino citizen cannot enter the U.S. Soil, so can't the U.S. soldier come to Philippines, and underlying the sovereignty as well as independent of the Philippines thinking as an answer for all the critics. A lot of speculation had happened because there was speculations that he did not consult and did not have support of different legs of the government. And of course, there was speculation whether it will go ahead after 180 days of a notice period. And sure enough, we had that change of mind early this month. which is provisional because it's suggesting only 6 months, with potential another 6 months. So we don't know where we firmly stand at the moment, but the change of the circumstances, geopolitical circumstances, including the pandemic, as we've mentioned, has changed the context as well. Now, of course, the VFA is not the only pillar of the US-Philippines military alliance and defense relationship. Of course, we have the Mutual Defense Treaty from 1951 still in place, as well as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, from 2014. But a lot of observers and experts have pointed out that without VFA, which provides a legal framework for rotational access and large-scale entry of American troops into Philippines, actually the alliance becomes practically useless, or it's been called already an empty shell. So there was a lot of worries. What would that mean for the Philippines? Because the U.S. not only it's not about the U.S. presence, but also it could allow quick and swift actions. For example, in the humanitarian disasters, like it was the case in 2013 Haiyang typhoon, which the U.S. As well as others, but U.S. also provide a quick and swift humanitarian crisis assistance there. Of course, it's very important also in anti-terrorism combat, as well as other more traditional military trainings and exercises. So all of that would be severely hampered and questioned if the VFA really was to be cancelled. The remaining question is really about whether it will go ahead after 6 months or another 6 months or after a year, or is it still up to negotiation? Why has the change of mind happened so abruptly? What was really behind? Was it domestically discordance within the Filipino government, or was it other negotiation chip over there? What will happen to the working troops already in the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao and other intelligence gathering operations critical to counterterrorism actions? How do Southeast Asian other fellows, other countries that have stake in South China Sea claims see that? What would it mean to China, of course? And how is Philippines planning to go about its own defense spending, training of its troops, and in general, how would that affect its defense policy? So those are all big questions that we will hope to get some answers to and do a lot of thinking about. But in more, just to start on that speculations, I think this is the decision, as chaotic as it seemed, as well as the change of mind early this month, early June. It's whether it is a blip or it's actually showing a larger, longer trend in the U.S.-Philippines relations. We have the era that of big personalities, President Duterte as well as President Trump, who seem to be very affecting the relations, bilateral relations, as well as broader, but in a very personalistic conduct of a leader, often uncoordinated with other legs of government, and seemingly affecting the reliability of either country. It is important for the Philippines. It would be an important change if that really goes ahead, because since the Cold War, Philippines' national security was basically based on the division of labor, where the United States assumed responsibility of external defense, and therefore, for example, Philippines' military spending on defense lags behind the rest of the ASEAN average at around over 1%, where the rest of ASEAN is around 2%. Of course, these numbers will differ, but it tells you about the conditions of the Philippines defense issues. So those are a lot of big questions that we are still grappling with because of the fast-changing nature. But it's very critical to look at the Philippines from its strategic geography if we want to talk about the broader implications for the region, where its position is vis-a-vis in the South China Sea, but also what would that mean for the concentric defense geographic positioning. There are a lot of details and the development of the US-Philippines relations that I can go into, and that will set context to where it is going. But in general, I think first, the perception of US alliance in the region, as particularly with Southeast Asia, is not doing very well. Philippines is one case. Thailand is another case. Those are two treaty allies of the US in the region. So in general, that abrogation of the visiting force agreement would affect and further confirm that perception. Second is the thing, of course, Southeast Asian actors do a lot of thinking on what that implication will mean to them, especially those who have claims in the South China Sea. But there are limited public debate and discussion on that issue because in the very much ASEAN way, they don't like to publicly debate other countries' matter. But that doesn't mean that they don't do a lot of thinking. So I will leave it there because I do want to get Malcolm into more deeper dive into the domestic context, as well as to John and Jingdong for US and China perspective before we get into further details and questions. Thank you.
Keep them coming. So from this, from my perspective, what we do like to do now is invite Malcolm to provide his initial comments. And just so it's clear, when we were talking with Malcolm, we really asked him to focus down on his perspectives from a Philippines government perspective. So if he seems to have that focus, he of course could make a wide variety of comments, but and we invite him to do so. But we're really interested in what the Philippine perspective is.
Thanks, John, and I'd first like to thank ASPI for inviting me and the ASPI strategist for putting up my weblog post on the VFA decision, which goes into some more detail. And I'm wearing my Philippine barong shirt to try to get into the feel. I think it's also lucky that we're having this seminar now and not 15 days earlier, because 15 days earlier was the date that the 1 June decision came out. And of course, we're 2 hours ahead of Manila, so we would have been talking about something that wouldn't have lasted very long. I want to make 7 quick points about the US-Philippine defense relations and broader relations under the Duterte administration. I think the Duterte administration that came into power in June 2016 has made 2 changes and 1 constant to the US-Philippine defense relationship very clear. How long they'll last after President Duterte is no longer president in mid-2022. We can have a seminar then, ASPI. The first constant is that the Philippine domestic politics is the primary driver of the trajectory of the alliance relationship, and particularly for setbacks in that relationship. So certainly the announcement of the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement in February 11th fits into that. But if you go back to 1991 and 92, when the Philippine Senate voted not to renew the leases on the US bases at Subic Bay and Clark, we can see that play out as well. So it's not US domestic politics or Pentagon strategy that is a primary driver of the direction of the bilateral relationship, but Philippine politics, and particularly the fact that it's a former colony of the United States. So Philippine nationalism is organized with the United States as the other, as President Duterte and his first foreign secretary, Perfecto Yesay, have made clear. Perfecto Yesay wrote a Facebook post calling how America had failed the Philippines and talked about treating us as little brown brothers. I couldn't see Australian foreign minister ever writing a Facebook post about the ANZUS alliance along those lines. So the first constant, which we'll see forever, is that Philippine domestic politics, and particularly post-colonial national sentiments, is a primary and somewhat unique factor in the relationship. I think the biggest change we've seen under the Duterte administration, that the January 23rd threat to terminate the VFA and the February 11th note verbal from the Philippines to the United States to do that fits into this, is President Duterte is the first president to actively seek to weaken the bilateral alliance, with both a focus on the alliance's role in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea dispute with China, and in Mindanao and the counterterrorism activities. So Duterte called for all American troops and advisors to be thrown out of Mindanao more than once, as well as presenting the US and the Philippine-US alliance as a source of destabilization in the West Philippine Sea, and not China's artificial islands and military bases in the Philippine continental shelf. You can see this before February 11th with Duterte's consistent stalling of the enactment of the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, even claiming that the United States is placing nuclear weapons in the would-be EDCA facilities, even though there's no proof of that. He has threatened exercises, never to have exercises again, and then to rescale them. So in that sense, the VFA termination decision is just the latest in a series of moves led by the president, the chief commander-in-chief, and the chief architect policy to weaken the alliance. In 1991 and 92, President Corazon Aquino supported the renewal of the US bases, and it was the Senate, I think from 13 to 11, if I remember, that voted to terminate those leases. The second change hasn't got as much focus internationally and in the Philippines and in Australia, partially because there isn't such a dynamic and charismatic leader as Duterte behind it. And that is that the alliance supporters in the Philippines, particularly within the armed forces of the Philippines and the larger defense community, since the loss of Scarborough Shoal to Chinese control in 2012 in the West Philippine Sea, have wanted more from the US alliance than the Mutual Defense Treaty and the Visiting Forces Agreement provides the Philippines. EDCA in 2014 was the Aquino administration attempt to deepen the relationship to help address these Chinese-Philippine problems, thinking that the alliance doesn't necessarily serve Philippine interests, particularly in the West Philippine Sea, as much as they had expected. We can see this in 2018 when the Philippine Defense Secretary, Delfin Lorenzana, called the American in the cabinet by Duterte himself, and Duterte has also kidded that Lorenzana is a CIA plant. Lorenzana called for a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, the 1951 Defense Treaty, and mused about it not necessarily being any longer useful to the Philippines. So it's not only that Duterte came into power and is the first president to actively work against the alliance, but even strong alliance supporters, if you want to use that language, in the Philippines, including the defense secretary, are wanting more from the United States and the alliance than particularly in the West Philippine Sea. So there's kind of changes on both sides of the alliance argument in the Philippines that make the situation more dynamic. I think the 1 June decision, going back to the 15 days ago, first of all, it shows, as I talk about in my strategist post, the benefit of the cooling off period, the 180-day cooling off period in the termination clause of the Visiting Forces Agreement, clearly allows supporters for a continuation of the alliance and hopefully enforcement or enactment of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement to have, in this case, 110 days to change the president's mind. Clearly, outside countries with an interest in a stable US-Philippine alliance also factored in to put their voices in. Certainly Japan at the moment is in negotiations for a status of forces agreement with the Philippines. If the US visiting forces agreement is overthrown. Japanese interests would not be served. Australia is the second country after the United States with a status of forces agreement for the Philippines. I doubt many in Canberra or Russell would think it would be good if Australia became the only one. So I think that 180 days provided enough time for the, call it the status quo and alliance supporters to help at least momentarily change President Duterte's mind from January 23rd and February 11th. However, as Huong noted, it's kind of like a 3-point turn. To turn your car, you need to make a 3-point turn, as I learned when I learned to drive my car in Canberra. I think the 1 June decision is a 1-point turn in the 3-point turn. So we're not anywhere out of the woods. So I think looking forward, what's the best chance for the VFA to be off life support and not facing termination? I don't think leaving it to the mysterious calculations of President Duterte as the chief architect of Philippine foreign policy and the commander-in-chief alone is the best way forward. I think the best chance for the VFA to stay in place after December 1st is if the Senate case in the Supreme Court that argues that the Senate needs to concur with the withdrawal from the VFA, since the VFA is a treaty-level legal instrument. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of that case, then I think the VFA will be on much firmer ground, because I cannot see a majority of the 23 at the moment Philippine senators voting to terminate the visiting forces agreement. So let's hope the Supreme Court rules in favor of Philippine security interests, Australian security interests, Japanese security interests, American security interests, and regional security as a whole. I'll leave my comments there. Thanks.
Thanks, Malcolm. Now, what I'd like to at this stage is get a more a US perspective on this, and I caveat that statement before I hand over the baton to John Powers, that John is in fact an Australian, despite the very thick accent. And having spent 4 decades on and off working inside the Beltway in DC, he certainly comes with some knowledge of that, but he does not speak on behalf of the US government, to make that clear. So look, John, thank you very much for agreeing today, and over to you to hear your perspectives of what the American position on this might just be.
Okay, thank you, John. Excuse me. And thank you to all those who are tuning in today. I already see by some of the questions, there's a lot about the treaty and things like that. And as both a former commander in the Army and also as an operator with one of the intelligence agencies, whenever I was given a warning order to deploy, the very first thing that I always asked is, what is the SOFA that is in place, Status of Forces Agreement? Or if there was not a SOFA, what is the VFA that is in place? And what are the rules of engagement? Because I couldn't do any planning, or my staff couldn't do any planning, a legal framework in which we were deploying our forces. And so as a planner and a commander and as an operator, the first things I always go to are those authoritative instruments of policy and law, whether it be international law or US law or the law that of the country that we're going into, to determine the conditions we can deploy under. So I just want to take a moment. We've talked a lot about VFA. We've talked a lot about SOFA. And I just want to go over it again, maybe a little bit, because it is so important to the whole discussion. Not only the discussion that is applicable to the Philippines and the U.S. relationship, but also if the VFA is terminated, the ripple effect it has on the other documents between the U.S. and the Philippines. But as importantly, for our listening audience, it's important that you also understand that these documents and these arrangements are with other nations as well within the region, but each one has its own character. So, you know, from a legal perspective or a policy perspective, the VFA, or the Visiting Forces Agreement, just generally is, it, as already stated, it's an agreement that permits foreign forces in a nation. And the VFAs are similar in intent as a SOFA, or a Status of Forces Agreement, but it usually just covers forces that are there temporarily, whereas a SOFA covers forces based in the host nation as well as those forces that may come in. Now, before the treaty, portions of the treaty in 1991-92 were not violated but abrogated. There was a Status of Forces Agreement that the U.S. had with the Philippines. And where a Status of Forces Agreement is different is it's more concerned with legal issues associated with uniform and civilian defense personnel and property. Items a SOFA covers are things like entry and exit into the country, which a VSA covers as well. But it also covers things like tax liabilities, postal services, employment terms for host country nationals. But probably the most contentious issue and probably the biggest difference between a SOFA and a VFA is that a SOFA usually outlines criminal jurisdiction, at which courts have jurisdiction if crimes are committed in that host country. And as the VFA pertains to that's in existence in the Philippines, one of the sticking points is that if a crime was committed in the Philippines by a U.S. visiting forces member or Department of Defense civilian, they were not subject to Filipino law. And that's usually, you know, one of the biggest sticking points that is between, or the biggest difference is the judicial thing. Now, the U.S. has in place right now SOFAs with Australia as well as with Japan and South Korea because we've got permanent forces here that come in and out. And I can tell you, having from my time working in the U.S. Embassy here in Canberra, the devil is in the detail of those things. Whereas the Visiting Forces Agreement allows the rapid movement of folks. Now, the VFA, as it pertains to the Philippines right now, to get to that specifically, as already noted, it's been in place since 1998, and it grants the legal status to U.S. forces, both uniformed and Department of Defense civilians who are there in the Philippines temporarily for exercises, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and other contingencies. But the legal status, as already mentioned, is that they do something wrong by Filipino law, they are subject to, in all probability, they will leave the country, but are subject to either Uniform Code of Military Justice, they're uniform people, or in the U.S. Now, without the legal protection granted by a VFA or a SOFA, defense forces, be they from the United States, be Australia, the UK, or wherever, they're not gonna operate in that country because their legal status is such that most foreign nations are not going to subject their personnel to the laws of another nation unless it's specifically outlined. So in 1998, when the VFA came into existence, it was so that U.S. forces could once again enter into the Philippines so that they could respond to humanitarian relief exercises. And in fact, as I mentioned, not 1998, one of the things that the U.S. was rapidly able to affect because of the VFA that they had in place was responding to that super typhoon Yolanda that hit. And as a result of the VFA, the U.S. was one of the first ones to show up with relief. Now, if this VFA is eventually terminated either by the Philippines or by the U.S., it would not automatically invalidate the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951, nor would it force the United States to pull out all service personnel and equipment that are currently there in the country. However, it would place all those folks that are there. And currently, as of last month, talking to some of my mates back in Washington, there's approximately about 200 folks from the U.S. there in the Philippines right now, but it would put them in a legal limbo. Without the VFA, if we were going to rely just on the MDT, it would make responsiveness into the Philippines much, much more difficult for forces or even individuals, because they'd have to go through the whole visa process and everything else. Now, we've talked as well, and I think it's important to point out about the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. That's kind of with a treaty, that's kind of the bedrock. There's a lot of things that are added to it. In fact, when we talk about this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, that's kind of an annex to the Defense Treaty. This, as we know, it was ratified by both senates of both countries in 1992, in 1952, but that is what everything's built on. It's that's the core document. If the VFA went away, as already mentioned, would the Mutual Defense Treaty, the MDT, still remain in effect? Yes, it would. Would it have as much teeth? No, it would not, because it doesn't provide for a lot of the devil in the detail as far as legal status and how forces can operate there. The other thing that you've heard quite a bit about is this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which came into place in 2014, and actually was held up a wee bit until the Filipino Supreme Court affirmed it in 2015. And in essence, it's a supplement, as already mentioned, to the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, and it is what the 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement reaffirms those things in the EDCA. It, in essence, just assists in developing a collective capability to resist armed attacks, and for helping in modernization, helping maintain equipment, and also the forces that were deployed to help with counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations. The VFA is very specific in the sense, though, it only allows U.S. forces and contractors to operate out of agreed locations. It's not like they're running willy-nilly all over the Philippines. These are agreed upon positions. The EDCA, which was put in place in 2014, is going to be reviewed in 2024 after 10 years. And thereafter, it'll continue in force unless terminated by either party. But once again, if the VFA goes away, the EDCA is not worth the ink that's on the paper. Under the VFA, although U.S. forces may exercise operational control and put troops and equipment and other things in agreed upon locations, the Philippines, the Filipino government, the defense forces of the Philippines, they still retain ownership of all those agreed locations. In fact, besides Subic and Clark Air Force Base, which were major bases for the United States in the 70s and 80s. There are 5 other bases that the U.S. is operating out of. And in fact, part of the agreement as part of the VFA is the U.S. has put a lot of construction and other things into that. In tune, really, since 1998, the U.S. has put about $1.3 billion of new infrastructure into the Philippines. So but you know, the treaty or the VFA, as a result of it, the U.S. cannot create any permanent forces or any permanent bases within the Philippines, and all the things that the U.S. builds or put in places or anything else, all that investment in capital and structure and things like that will be handed over to the Philippines. And the other thing is, and this was one of the sticking points that led to the parts of the treaty, the basing in 1991, is no nuclear weapons or capabilities can come into the Philippines. I'd just like to point out as well, before turning it back to John, is that this isn't the first time when Duterte threatened to terminate this treaty. This has happened before, and then the last time it was because U.S. aid was holding back on some funds for poverty projects in the Philippines. Now, the loss of the Filipino bases, this would be a huge operational and logistic burden for the United States. Now, there are 4 other potential operating locations, as already mentioned: South Korea, Japan, both the mainland and Okinawa, Australia, Guam, and of course, either or the United States. But now we're starting to get into really speed, size, and accuracy if something were to occur within either the South China Sea or even a worse case, something in Taiwan. So I'll leave it at that point now and turn it back to John so we can continue the discussion.
Thank you, John Powers. Finally, and probably with one of the most difficult tasks today, is to provide us with a Chinese perspective as well as their own perspective on this situation, is Jingdong. And I'd like to invite you to make your opening remarks, please, sir.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks to ASPI for the invitation to be part of this webinar, and thanks to the audience. I've seen already lots of questions been pouring in. What I'm going to do is to basically lay out sort of three general kind of sets of Chinese responses or assessment of the situation. Now, the first one is Chinese reactions to the Duterte's announcement about the abrogation of VFA. Now, of course, this has been reversed and suspended. Secondly is a general assessment from the Chinese analysts about overall security ties between the Philippines and the U.S. in particular during the Duterte's almost 4 years administration up to date. And third is to speculate and talk a little bit about the future kind of in the context of both the Sino-Philippine relations and emerging and intensifying U.S.-China strategic rivalry, and the larger issues to which a number of additional parties are also concerned, that is the South China Sea territorial dispute. Now, the first one, I think the Chinese reaction to the announcement back in February, there are quite a number of speculations or assessment. Basically, I think apart from a few articles in the such media outlet like the Global Times, which pretty much were glowing and saying, well, this action dealt a severe blow to the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy because it severely constrains U.S. military personnel's actions and activities in the Philippines. But also to comment on why President Duterte made that decision. Of course, the immediate trigger is the U.S. refusal to give a visa to a former Philippine police chief. And then there's a long kind of a tradition or certain rhetorical lines of Duterte of very quite anti-U.S. stance and positions. And there are other related reasons that may be that the Chinese assessment also speculated on is, of course, an equal nature of the U.S.-Philippine defense arrangement back all the way to 1951 MDT. As also the VFA basically allows sort of the U.S. military, either uniformed or uniformed defense personnel immunity to Philippine laws. And also from time to time, of course, the U.S. criticism of the Philippine domestic policies, such as Duterte's drug war tactics, human rights record, and so forth. And the larger context is, of course, Duterte, since coming to power in 2016, has sought to reverse some of his predecessor, President Aquino III, overtly dependence on the U.S. However, I think Beijing recognized, and certainly those analysts recognize, the deep security arrangement between the two countries, a long history of bilateral ties. You can go back to 1899, the early part of 20th century, and the Second World War, and certainly 1951 MDT and 2014 EDCA, and very deep kind of defense military ties and U.S. military assistance, arms sales, training, joint military exercise, and ongoing hundreds of bilateral military programs. And so to some extent, this also demonstrates maybe Duterte's action was a way to enhance its own bargaining chips. It's not really to fundamentally and irreversibly sever the relationship, although, I mean, he has threatened many times. And so you can see here Duterte may be exercising sort of a balancing act between China and the United States, and fundamentally, the Philippines has important and vital security interests that they has to depend on the U.S., especially with regard to the rise of China and its ongoing territorial dispute with China. Now, for the U.S., of course, before the suspension, of course, there were a lot of concerns, and previous speakers have already touched on several of them. And I think the most severe one would be the logistical loss of U.S. military operations, because even though the U.S. has a number of alternative bases in Japan, mainland Okinawa, Guam, and Darwin in northern Australia, but these pose significant challenges: the distance and the speed with which the U.S. military can do any contingencies in a timely fashion. Now, second is about Chinese assessment of U.S.-Philippine security cooperation during the Duterte administration for the past 4 years. I think with the exception of the early days of the Duterte administration, which were the president had certainly expressed very strong views and rhetoric, anti-U.S. rhetoric, and threatened to sever certain elements or aspects of the bilateral military to military or security relationship. But that was at the time of, right after the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration verdict, then the severe, kind of a sliding of bilateral relations between China and the Philippines. So Duterte, in a way, wanted to reverse this situation and seeing China as a potential partner for cooperation in certain areas, especially in the areas of economic development. And certainly the U.S. Obama administration and early days Trump administration did not help in the matter by their criticism of Duterte's policies, and which were seen as in the Philippines domestic affairs. But soon after that, I think initial several years of frictions between the two countries, pretty much there had always been a very strong military ties, and the Philippine domestic public opinions very favorable to maintaining that ties, and other domestic factions, and also were increasingly alarmed and worried about how far Duterte would go, and so to a more severe fracturing of the U.S.-Philippine ties. So in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, actually the bilateral military ties, not only had they been maintained, and also in terms of, in qualitative terms, certain aspect of that military relationships have been enhanced to some extent. For instance, there's a more frequent, more numerous bilateral military joint exercise, large U.S. arms sales between 2016, 2019, about half a sort of $1 billion of U.S. military sales to the Philippines, and the annual kind of a bilateral military exercise maintained around 280 to over 300 such exercise. And most importantly, the bilateral joint military exercises also expanded to multilateral military exercises. But also the Chinese analysts can detect among this general trends of continually a very strong bilateral military ties, there are differences between the Philippines and the U.S. I mean, for the U.S., of course, the primary objectives is to retain supremacy with the launch of the Indo-Pacific strategy to constrain and contain China's rise, and to build up defense network in the region, including getting India and then the Quad arrangement to confront the rise of China. For the Philippines, I think territorial dispute and the immediate sort of security concerns aside, it has some concerns of this intensifying U.S.-China military confrontation could drag the Philippines into this potential, any potential military conflict. At the same time, the Philippines also wanted to get a more unequivocal U.S. commitment with regard to territorial dispute with China, how the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty could be interpreted. Now, Secretary of State Pompeo made a statement with reference to U.S. commitment. It's basically stating that as the South China Sea is part of the Pacific, any armed attack on Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea would trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4 of the MDT. So that's about it. And so in summary, Duterte's policy in the last 4 years is basically pursuing a hedging strategy to maintain U.S.-Philippine defense ties, expanding economic cooperation with China, downplaying the South China Sea dispute, but also expand its ties to other countries in the region, such as Japan. For instance, the Duterte has not visited the U.S. once, but visited Japan 3 times already, and has been receiving Japanese defense articles, and so there's some collaboration. Now, finally, just to end this, is the future development and Sino-Philippine relations. I think one of the developments since Duterte came into power is the both countries have been quite careful in managing their territorial dispute. Although incidents continue, but both governments have tried to downplay those incidents and their impact on overall bilateral relations. And economic ties have obviously been one of the key aspects where Duterte wanted to expand to attract investment and so forth. And certainly there have been reports about a lot of Chinese promises of investment to the tune of about $24 billion, and Chinese investment commitment in building Subic Clark, base into industrial parks and railways and other areas cooperation, including resumption of joint exploration of maritime science cooperation, exploration of oil, and so forth. And of course, some of these economic sort of pledges, Chinese investment pledges, have not always yet materialized due to a number of other reasons. For the Philippines and Sino-Philippine relations in the coming years really depends on 2 key factors. One is Duterte would have another 2 years in power, so we don't know who would succeed him, and so that may introduce some change dynamics there. On the other hand, I think it's also how China manages territorial dispute with the Philippines, but also with a number of other claimant states. I think one of the reasons that the abrogation has been suspended, maybe, if you look at February and then up to now in June, a number of incidents have occurred in the first half of 2020. You can talk about China, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, and China, Malaysia. I mean, there's a number of incidents of with regard in the context of territorial dispute between China and all these other claimant states. So in that regard, and when you add the rumored reports that perhaps China will introduce a South China Sea air defense identification zone, and that would include, pretty much what the Philippines would consider to be its territorial seas and exclusive economic zones. And so all of these also introduce elements of caution that Duterte may have realized that apart from the oppositions from the domestic political field, there are indeed some of those uncertainties going forward in the months and years to come. So I will just stop here, and then maybe we can come back to some of those questions during the question time.
Thank you, Jingdong. Now, I'm going to do and use the facilitator's prerogative and ask a couple of questions, although our questions here are piling up. Now, one thing with that, one is always, and I did it to her when we produced our after COVID volume. I asked her to write 2,000 words on the whole of ASEAN's perspective on, an ASEAN perspective on after COVID, which was incredibly difficult. And so I'm not going to do that to you today, Huong. But what I am going to ask you is I noticed we covered off on a lot of countries, and Jingdong ruled my line saying we hadn't covered off totally some others. But I think, in a couple of sentences or a few minutes, what are the reactions likely to be in Hanoi? What are they likely to be in Jakarta to this? What are they to make of this situation?
John, so of course, Vietnam as the claim South China Sea has been watching the development quite closely, and obviously it is very different from the politics of Vietnam, and so there is a certain level of perhaps discomfort of how fastly things change, and just to follow up, to be able to follow up with the development. So obviously it would be seen not really very, very good for the interests in South China Sea for Vietnam and other claimants. Whether they say it publicly or not is another issue. As I mentioned, there's a culture of withdrawing, refraining from commenting on others' development. But it's not just Vietnam, it's not just Indonesia who is a stakeholder but not a direct claimant, but also others. Like, for example, when in 1990s the U.S. bases in Clark and Subic Bay were cancelled, Singapore stepped up, right, with offering the access to Changi Naval Base. So we didn't hear any of that. Obviously, it would be too soon, but we didn't hear any of that kind of volunteering efforts. Obviously, with Vietnam, it's been a long discussion whether there will be increased presence of the U.S. military and navy in the Vietnamese waters. In Nha Trang and Da Nang, and of course there are a lot of still limitations there. So that would give the region quite a bit of headache, given that with the current sentiment, even if the VFA were to be really going forward and be no longer in the place, I don't see any other at the current moment any other Southeast Asians stepping up and offering similar access that Singapore did with the Changi. And looking at the scan of the region, if you look at Southeast Asia, in terms of AXA that John mentioned, the acquisition cross-servicing agreement, the host of rotational deployment and routine access, only Philippines and Singapore have all three of them. So if one is missing, it's actually a big loss for the entire region, and we don't see any currently. We don't see any potential replacement.
And that is that, which is that in terms of in the statement, so when the letter from the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs refers to, and Jingdong gave his perspective, political and other developments in the region that changed their mind over the cooling off period. Would you have it a guess what you think the political and other developments in the region were?
I didn't hear the first part of your question, John, because you're on mute.
Oh, sorry.
But I think I got the gist of it. I think probably the biggest thing was the Chinese lasing Filipino ships. Here, because of the decision or the ruling in favor of the Philippines in regards to some of the islands, they really haven't pushed that under Duterte. They're getting along swell. My personal and professional opinion is, if that had been Vietnam who got that ruling, I think we would have seen a different posturing of how they would be defending or pushing their rights within those areas. But under Duterte, they really the Philippines really have not pushed anything in regards to that decision to any certain degree. It's kind of like business as usual because they don't want to upset the apple cart. But I do think that a couple of things. One, that Duterte, as I said, the Chinese have been pushing that relationship and the lasing or the radar of Filipino ships as they pass through. That got their attention very clearly. That's friends don't operate that way with one another. I also believe that that there were much like, and I think you and I had this discussion when I was getting ready for this prior to 1 June. One of the things that I was going to say was that the most predictable thing out of all this was that the two leaders involved are two of the most unpredictable leaders in the world. So the fact of the matter is that, much like Mr. Trump, Mr. Duterte does things on a whim without consultation. And sometimes you just got to sort of sit back and say, okay, there's the latest tweet or the latest blurb or whatever the case may be. And you sort of sit back and see how things happen. That's why I said that when this first ruffled, it wasn't because he had made similar threats before. The Pentagon, it was like a little boy crying wolf. Okay, let's see what he means this time. Now, in regards, like I said, there are probably several things, both what the Chinese did, but also his inner circle, plus all the background noise that happens either from the U.S. Embassy or the policy folks. There is a good, strong relationship between the U.S. And the Philippines, not only from a mill-to-mill perspective, but also with the senior executives, the bureaucrats, and the public servants, both in state, defense, and others. It's good. It's solid. It's been there for a while. The other aspect of is and I think it's important is the cultural aspect of it too. I mean, there are over 200,000 expats from the U.S. in the Philippines now, and I think there's close to 400,000 Filipinos in the U.S. as expats. Plus the relationship that's been there since the 1900s. That whole piece. So I don't think, although there's been friction points because nobody likes to have deployed forces from a foreign nation. It's a sovereignty thing. We didn't like having the bloody Brits in Boston. And you see where that got us. It's just one of those things from a sovereignty perspective. So I think the relationships, both culturally and militarily and diplomatically, as well as economically, are quite good. And those relationships are what are going to carry the day, regardless of a Mr. Trump or regardless of a Duterte. I think cooler heads will always prevail.
Malcolm, would you like to respond to that, I guess?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think both President Trump and the Trump administration has helped their own case, and I'm going to tie it to the COVID-19 pandemic that came from Wuhan to the Philippines in early January or late January, and is hitting the Philippines hard, both in total number of cases and economically. So I think it was April 19th or April 23rd, can't remember, President Trump himself made a phone call to President Duterte. So that was a Trump White House initiative, and they talked for 20 minutes about particularly U.S. support for the Philippine pandemic response. But I'm sure the VFA termination may have come up in the discussion. And if you look at the United States response or assistance to Southeast Asia for the pandemic, the Philippines is, I think, by far the largest recipient so far of bilateral aid, particularly from USAID, which at the moment is about $20 million with more to come. That's the largest in Southeast Asia, and that's much larger, at least at the bilateral level, than Chinese aid to the Philippines to respond to COVID-19. So I think that cooling period of 180 days, I'm sure John's right, lots of people, including the Japanese, Southeast Asian voices. It wouldn't surprise me if Taiwan might have tried to say something, since the US access to the Philippines is particularly crucial for Taiwan, that faces the largest threat from the PRC, but also allowed the United States and President Trump, as I say, to intervene in a positive way to show in a time of crisis, again, for the Philippines, how much the American relationship matters and delivers.
I mean, is China the winner here, though, in terms of, regardless of the outcome of, there's been a 6-month extension. And this question I'm really interested in from Jingdong, which is, is China the winner here, really? Because ultimately what we've seen is introducing further strategic unpredictability, at least in some quarters, about the status of the relationship between the US and the Philippines.
Right. I think what Beijing wants to see is obviously, number one, there's a degree of uncertainty or suspicions or losing confidence in the U.S. reliability. I mean, whatever the security arrangements that is. So this back and forth on VFA and some other uncertainties certainly help China in that direction. But whether China can really harvest any fruits, permanent, really important ones, it depends on how its own diplomacy is executed, and because sometimes your worst enemy is yourself. And just back to John Power's earlier comments of Chinese, logging laser on a Philippine boat or frigate naval ship, is sometimes, even though you say China is, quite authoritarian and President Xi has a lot of power, but actually on the ground, there are lots of competing factions and parochial interests, because I could imagine the Chinese Navy units operating in the South China Sea would not be receiving daily briefings, and whatever you do, you need to take into perspective the overall China's diplomacy and China's need and interest in projecting itself as a positive force, a peaceful rising power, because their remit is more about territorial integrity. I mean, you have to demonstrate and show that this is your claimed maritime territory. So you have competing kind of instructions and the central government's overall kind of instructions in a very ambiguous and ambivalent way. So the local actors could act in ways that are contrary to the country's interests. So whether China will take advantage of the developments that really promote its interest and to deal a permanent blow to U.S. interests really depends on what China itself is going to do, but also on what the U.S. is going to do. I mean, so in a certain ways, the two superpowers in competing for regional loyalty, allegiances sometimes perform in ways that just push those small countries and potential partner to the side of to the embrace of other side.
And Woggy wanted to respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to tie this question with one of a question from the audience, which asked similar question whether this automatically will mean a better relations for the Philippines and China. And there are a couple of dimensions to that. First, as we've underlined, all of us in the panel, even if the termination of UFA happens, that doesn't mean that there's no mutual defense treaty and then ACFA and all of that. But it is subsequently peeling off different elements. And that's, you don't do it at once, you do it gradually. Even if it doesn't go along the VFA, and we'll still have VFA, what has resulted those development is really erosion of trust. If you can't be reliant and be sure and rely on the defense relationship and that they are there no matter what. There's already friction between U.S. and the Philippines, be it from personalistic conduct of either of them, of Duterte or Trump, who are said to be like almost twins in many aspects. This is either Philippines Trump or US Duterte. It's already eroding the trust. It already has that negative effect. Now, whether it really will translate immediately into better relations with China, it's, as Jingdong said, question how they use it. But China is actually benefiting from it, because now it doesn't offer any replacement. It won't offer anything similar to the VFA for the Philippines or any type of alliance, but it has already one obstacle less, right? Now the question is for the Philippines, what path they will want to go, either being like Cambodia, which is very reliant on China, Indonesia being non-aligned, or like Vietnam self-reliance. And all of that we can debate the nuances and different paths. All of that will take time, but the path of Cambodia is not really viable path, because unlike Cambodia, Philippines has active claims and disputes in the South China Sea with China, so it can't go all the way that way, right? With non-alliance with Indonesia, it's not as big as second biggest in terms of population in Southeast Asia, but it's not as big as Indonesia. It can't afford being so removed from the defense debate. And with Vietnam, it's a very different history, different conditions, and it takes a long time to build that self-reliance. And this is what this is about. The narrative that Duterte is presenting is that we have to be more independent. We don't rely on anyone too much, whether it's US or just too traditional reliant. Yes, there's nothing wrong with that, but it takes time, efforts, and active policies to build that.
Malcolm.
To add on to his answer and the earlier ones, I guess if you look at it, if in June 2022, end of June 2022, President Rodrigo Duterte steps down from his single term, the VFA is still in place. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, probably unrevised, is still there. And the next president, whether it's his daughter or somebody else, doesn't take the same extremely personal embrace of China, then the US-Philippine alliance will have survived probably its greatest challenge. One can choose from when, and that's probably a sign of US strength and the kind of resilience and depth of the US position in not only in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. So if, as I say, Duterte doesn't live up to his rhetoric by the end of his term, that's probably a win for the United States. Americans may make a similar argument about Donald Trump's single or two terms and alliances with others.
Look, we've got about 12 minutes to go, colleagues. So what I'm going to do is fire off some questions from the audience, and really, if we can get a sort of a quick and fairly fast process of answering. Now, I'd like to start off with John. Ollie Saucer wanted to know, is the Philippines irreplaceable for the US geostrategic considerations as far as military access?
Yes, it is replaceable, but it's, as I said, but it'll be tough.
Yeah.
And it's one of the advantages of the VFA is it does allow quick movements in and out of forces. And when you look at time, space, and distance, as I was talking about before, if something were to happen in the South China Sea or in Taiwan, it's ideally located. But we do have other agreements with other countries around the area, it would just make it a wee bit more difficult in the long run. And you have to negotiate with those countries on exactly how they use those forces. I mean, for example, the South with Japan is pretty doggone clear that they're only going to, excuse me, allow U.S. forces in Title V kind of operations. Same thing with South Korea. So yes, it's doable, but makes it more difficult.
And I'll get Malcolm, in terms of John Lamney wants to know, has the Philippines signing of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017 had many implications on the alliance, considering how vehemently the US opposed and still opposes the TPNW?
Yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the 1987 Philippine Constitution has a clause about no nuclear weapons in the Philippines, and I think that was a point that when they were negotiating the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the Aquino administration also. So I don't think the 2017 signing of the treaty changed things that much, because the 1987 Constitution already did that.
Okay, we're going back up. I've got a question here about the Intel leak, which is, and this is a general question, I'm not sure if anyone's got coverage of it, which is, what do you think about the Intel leak that China is keen to support potential candidates in the 2020 election to sustain current dynamics of the Sino-Philippines relations? So I guess for that one, Malcolm, I might see if you heard anything about that and have got any comments.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of research done on both the 2016 Philippine election and the 2019 midterm elections, looking for foreign interference, to use that language, into it, and they're by people who are very good at that and have access to all of the information from Twitter and Facebook, which are the two big platforms in the Philippines. And there was kind of no sign of, no clear evidence at all of that, unlike, for example, studies done in European elections when it comes to Russia and others. So, so far there hasn't been any signs in recent Philippine elections of successful foreign interference. I'm very sure that China, the United States, and everybody will be watching the 2022 election closely, but their ability to manipulate it may be less than many worry about.
Now, the next question is really for all of you. So, and this is 6 months' time, where is the VFA at from your specific perspectives? And we might start off with Jingdong, and then we'll go from there to Huong, and then we'll finish off with JP, and then Malcolm.
Well, it really depends on the nature of the U.S.-Philippine relations in the next 6 months, and also depends on what China's been, is going to do. So you could imagine two scenarios. One is to have another pause for another 6 months, or maybe to negotiate something new that at least gave the Philippines a sense of that they claim back some sovereignty, and maybe adding some provisions that would be to that effect.
Risky business, John, asking to predict Duterte and Trump's administration's decisions 6 months from now. But I do think I shared Jingdong's feelings. I think if was a provision that is suspended for 6 months with potential another 6 months, there are chances that they will use that another 6 months. And in the next 6 months, we will have, hopefully, if everything goes to the plan, election in the US. So perhaps that would be another turning point to further inform a decision on either side.
Who's next?
You go for it, Malcolm, and then we'll finish off the US perspective. Sorry, JP.
I guess, first of all, they're 70 days plus 6 months, because they suspended the countdown of 180 days, I think, at the 110-day mark. So we're talking about 2 more months or 8 more months come December 1st. And it's in my strategist weblog, to give it a shameless plug again. The Supreme Court of the Philippines may come in and some senses, as I say, take the VFA out of Duterte's hands only. And the Philippine Senate has, in other instances, not followed the president's wishes despite his supermajority. But my deeper feeling, which is only a feeling, is the 6-month suspension with a possible another 6-month suspension may be a bit of a safe face-saving exercise for the Philippines, and that the decision to not terminate the VFA may be clearer than the 6-month plus another 6-month possible suspension suggests.
John?
I believe the VFA will be in place at the end of 6 months. And I think it'll be, and the reason I believe that is for several reasons. One, when it was first brought to Trump's attention, he was kind of like, okay, no big deal, that saves us some money. You know, it was kind of water off a duck's back. And so if it doesn't happen, he'll use that from an electoral perspective of what he's been doing in some of these other agreements. You know, he's talking about pulling troops out of Germany. We're getting out of Afghanistan. He will use that to be able to say, hey, I got the forces out of, you know, with all this money we're giving to the Philippines. You know, so that spin will come back. If in fact we go back to the VFA goes into effect, he'll use it to as a means to show I'm fighting terrorism. I said we'd go and make a commitment into Asia. I said we were going to, you know, we're going to check the Chinese. So he's going to play it both ways. It's a win-win for Trump, no matter how he spins it. The other piece, though, reason I believe that is because there are certain folks in the Pentagon, in particular the Secretary of Defense Esper, who is a West Point graduate, along with a lot of other folks. But there's a deep commitment, just from a cultural perspective, as I mentioned before, towards the Philippines. And it is very, very important to the defense of the U.S., not only from a U.S. perspective, but also how it projects power within this region. And what we haven't talked a lot about, but touched on the edges, is the relationship with our other allies in the region. So I believe there'll be a full, you know, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on that we're not privy to ensure that Duterte saves face on this, and Trump comes out looking good. But I think 6 months from now, it's not going to be as contentious. I think it'll just be okay. It was one of those things that happened, and and if Biden's elected, it's definitely, I believe that Biden will continue on the way of trying to have something in the Pacific with the Philippines. But yeah.
My final point, we've got 2 minutes to go, is this. We are the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, so I'm going to put it to you, the panel. And is there an opportunity here for Australia as an alternative for basing? Is it for being part of supply chains? Is there a risk associated with it for the Australian government in terms of the non-signing of the VFA? And what we might do is I might ambush Huong, who's looking very happy with this answer, for a start point for this, to give everyone else a time to run with it.
Well, yes. So one of the concept of this webinar or in original workshop is to explore the opportunities. Obviously, there are opportunities, and geography says there are a lot of reasons why we should be thinking of Australia in particular. Obviously, Australia's very stable relations, alliance relations with the US, at least comparatively to the wider Indo-Pacific region, makes it an ideal candidate. Whether there are appetite, whether there will be resources, and how timely it could be executed is another thing, because obviously it will be situated in a broader and debate, John, after COVID, how countries recover and how much appetite is there for really defense spending.
JP, inside the Beltway perspective?
I believe that there is an opportunity for Australia, particularly from the standpoint of we've already got the Marines up there, but even more of a footprint if Australia has the stomach for it, and if they don't make the SOFA agreement so arduous and make it hurt, because I've been part of that here in Australia before. They do not make it easy to do certain things. And it goes back to the sovereignty thing. But I do believe there's great opportunities for some of that capability to move towards Australia, particularly as it pertains to both naval forces and air forces, and even to a point of pre-positioning equipment that potentially can be used for exercises, but more importantly, humanitarian aid. And I think that's something that, I believe that Australia could lean forward a wee bit more on. As we recall in the Rose Garden in 2017, Xi said those islands are not going to be used for military purposes. Well, what's stopping for Australia, for example, of attempting to do joint operations with the Chinese from those islands? If they're not for military purposes, let's think out of the box and see how we can use them for humanitarian aid purposes, how we can use them to stop as bases to stop people smuggling and drug smuggling and things of that nature. We've got to stop thinking so conventionally and start thinking about how to create solutions that benefit our Australia. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be security and defense related. A strong economy and strong diplomatic strategies, at the end of the day, are more viable and will protect us and safeguard us more so than military security.
Thanks, John. Look, we've run out of time. We've got a lot of questions coming from people, and what I want to do is first off thank the people who've logged in today for the webinar, an hour and a half of their lunch taken up by this, and we do appreciate that. I want to thank the Northern Territory Government for their sponsorship for the activity, and I want to thank my panel members, specifically John Powers, Malcolm Cook, Jingdong. I appreciate the time you've given us and the honest answers and dialogue, and of course my ASPI colleague and friend Huong for really bringing her work into my program on the Northern Australia security. So I appreciate it. So thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and continuing to look at a variety of different perspectives on what happens to the VFA in the future. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.